So welcome to the International Psychohistorical Association's 38th Annual Convention. In welcoming you today, let me say a few big things and a few equally important little things. The big things have to do with the mission of this organization. Psychohistorians have a unique contribution to make in understanding the world and applying that knowledge to advance individual and public mental health. I find it daunting to think about the problems that threaten humanity: nuclear weapons proliferation, political extremism at home and abroad, reckless energy and environmental policies, etc., etc. I am grateful that we can confront reality together and fashion conceptual tools for understanding the past and shaping a better future. Together we can make a difference. Thank you. So let me go now to our first speaker. Diane Perlman. Dr. Diane Perlman is a clinical and political psychologist, mediator, and visiting scholar at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. Her work encompasses the psychological dynamics of enmity, nuclearism, and terrorism, as well as conflict transformation and the design of alternative security policies. Dr. Perlman participates in United Nations conferences and non-governmental organizations and is co-author with Joanna Santa Barbara and Johan Galtung of Reconciliation, Clearing the Past, Building a Future. And you can visit her website at consciouspolitics.org.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Brian, for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here and to be back after several years. So, by way of introducing myself related to this topic, I came to learn about the Holocaust when I was a teenager. And in addition to being horrified, I was really intrigued about how human beings could do such a thing and how society could allow it to happen. And I asked my mother, how could this happen? She said, well, we didn't know. So I had a commitment that you can't not know anything, and also that you can't remain silent. And then I was also curious and had this thought that people couldn't prevent it because they had no idea that it was going to happen. And if you don't know something's going to happen, you can't prevent it, so you have to know. And if you know something's going to happen, you can prevent it. And in 1981, I went to my first symposium of Physicians for Social Responsibility at University of Pennsylvania on medical consequences of nuclear war. And it was my first exposure to this, and like many other people, I was awakened by Helen Caldicott and Vic Seidel and other people were there. And I learned that there was the equivalent of 4 tons of TNT for every man, woman, and child on the planet. And I thought that was pretty insane. And the physicians had their shtick, which is basically, ground zero, people be vaporized, there's blast effects, burn effects, fireball, not enough physicians, and that as a physician, that their commitment is if there's something that you can't cure, you have to prevent it. So I figured, well, we know this could happen, so we have to work to prevent it. So this year is the 70th anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and August 9th. And it's also the 45th year of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, just by a show of hands, how many people here heard anything in the news or were aware that last month there was a meeting of 190 delegates from 190 countries meeting for 4 weeks at the UN to review the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? How many people knew about it? Okay. So 4 or 5. So how many of you heard about anything about it on the news? Okay. So it was something so important was not covered very well. So I was there for the entire 4 weeks. So obviously from what I've said, I feel a responsibility to raise consciousness about this and to teach about this topic. So for my presentation today, I'm going to go through the psychohistory of nuclear weapons and up to the NPT, what happened. And I'm choosing to integrate all of that, to weave it together in one presentation. because this is my one chance to present this, and I feel it's really important. So I'd like to start with a demonstration that some of you may have heard in the 80s. So if you close your eyes for a minute. All right, the first sound you're going to hear represents the firepower of the bomb, of the Hiroshima bomb. Right. The next sound you're going to hear represents the total firepower of World War II. The next sound that you're going to hear represents the amount of firepower on one Trident submarine. And then this is marked down from the 1980s. This next sound you're going to hear represents the total number of nuclear weapons that's now in the possession of the United States. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Okay, so I mentioned that the physicians had their shtick worked out, so I figured I'm a psychologist. What do we have to say about this? And at the time I didn't know. So I set out for the last 32 years to explore this subject. Okay, so Robert J. Lifton, psychiatrist, who was the first psychiatrist to study Hiroshima survivors, was very committed to the nuclear issue. He said nuclear weapons are beyond psychology. They alter our relationship to life and death. They impair our capacity to confront the bomb. They impair our ability to confront issues vital to our survival, and that we have a limited capacity to imagine the real. The presence of these mass-killing devices creates staggering problems and distorts our thinking and blunts our feeling about the problems. And he also coined the term psychic numbing. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this. So Einstein famously said that the splitting of the atom has changed everything except the way we think. Thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive. And also he said there's been a quantum leap technology in our age, but unless there's another quantum leap in human relations, unless we learn to live in a new way towards one another, there will be a catastrophe. I also want to acknowledge the cartoonist Tony Auth, who sadly passed away last year. And he was a cartoonist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I used to come every year and go through his files, and he let me take them, so you'll see some of his work here. But this just shows that or as Mark Davidson said, that we're technological giants, but morally we're like infants. So this is where our work lies. So I'm going to go through a psychological history of nukes, then nuclear myths, illusions, and absurdity, some from Robert J. Lifton and Richard Falk, and indefensible weapons, and some from me. And then I'll give you a flavor of the UN, of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, and then we'll talk about a conflict analysis. Okay, so from the history of the bomb, in 1939, that there were several Jewish scientists who left Germany, and that there was some concern that Hitler was developing an atomic weapon, and that we needed to start a program to get it before they did. And this is Sir Joseph Brooklet, and I actually interviewed him. He started Pugwash. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. And when he was a young scientist, he did a physics experiment, and he could intuit that the next experiment after that would be the splitting of the atom, and he could intuit the whole arms race from that. And he agonized and agonized over what to do with that knowledge, as a scientist wants to proceed with their knowledge. And then when he felt that that Germany could get the bomb, that resolved the moral issues in his mind, and he came to join the Manhattan Project. And David Lada knows more about this than I do, but he's the only scientist that quit the Manhattan Project after Hitler committed suicide. And he basically said, hey, we don't have to do this anymore. There's no reason to do it. So he was the only one who quit, And also the government kept secret from the scientists that Germany wasn't about to get the bomb so that they would keep on working for it. And it says, congratulations, Dr. Teller, it's a bomb. So we had the birth of the bomb. And as you probably know, the first 3 bombs were Trinity, Little Boy, and Fat Man. The first was exploded in the Nevada desert on July 16th, 1945. And then Hiroshima, August 6th, and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and we switched enemies to the Japanese. Truman, who actually didn't even know of the existence of nuclear weapons before he became president, once he was president, and he learned about them, and he thanked God that the bomb came to us instead of our enemies. And we pray that God may guide us to use it in his ways and for his purposes. Then, as you all know, we targeted Hiroshima, which was devastating, and of course, lots of humanitarian consequences, which is a big issue, which I'll discuss at the UN. And we did a lot of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands to test the effects of radiation using the citizens as guinea pigs. And I'll come back to that later. And people downwind, they knew that it was downwind, and many people were harmed and had health problems. There were a lot of government propaganda films saying how they helped us with peace. And there were a lot of birth defects, jellyfish babies, and the people are suffering until now. And the Marshall Islanders have an initiative at the UN, which I will come to later. And it was the equivalent of 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every day if you take the average of the number of tests spread out over 12 years. And then the Cold War began around 1947, and then we had the Soviet-American arms race. And for those of you, most of us in the audience with some or a lot of gray hairs, this will be a walk down memory lane. And for younger people, you'll get a flavor of what the times were like. So the Russians are ahead, the Americans are ahead. And we were really gripped by fear. And Ralph K. White, who died several years ago at the age of 100, who was a colleague, mentor of mine, he talked about fearful warriors. And he said that the madness that's carrying the world closer to nuclear war has a psychological explanation. Each side, though fundamentally afraid, misperceives the nature of the danger it faces. Each side imagines that it faces an inherently, implacably aggressive enemy, when it actually faces an enemy as fearful as itself, an enemy driven mainly by fear to do the things that lead to war. So there was, as you may recall, we had McCarthyism, better dead than red, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there was a lot of, the whole culture was very intensely focused on the spread of communism and the nuclear arms race. And this is General Haig, that basically we see communism everywhere. This Rorschach test, Mr. Haig, tell me what you see when you look at it. So nuclearism. Robert J. Lifton coined the term nuclearism, and he defined it as a psychological, political, and military dependence on nuclear weapons, the embrace of weapons as a solution to a wide variety of human dilemmas, most ironically that of security. And then there's nuclear addiction. So we had to have more and more and more nuclear weapons. So if you think about it, what's the difference if we had 20,000 nuclear weapons or 30,000 make us more secure? So a friend and colleague of mine, Steve Kull, K-U-L-L, a psychologist at the time, was interviewing high-level officials in the RAND Corporation, in defense here and also in the Soviet Union. And he would ask them, you know, what's the difference? You know that if you have more nuclear weapons, it doesn't really increase your security. And they would answer something like, well, we know that, but they don't know that, so we have to give the appearance that we're ahead. So this idea of being ahead in the arms race. And he said, instead of calling it the Department of Defense, we should call it the Department of Defense Mechanisms.